moved it?
I did.
Welcome to episode 4 of Free Speech. Today we're going to be talking about plastics, something that I think isn't something that is involved in a lot of discussions. Obviously, recycling's been a more important trend in the last 10, 20 years. But in terms of our consumption, it hasn't really limited us much. We're still growing in population, and the average person uses a bunch of plastic. And the amount of plastic we've seen per person has increased over time. The biggest example of something that showcases that, for those of you that are familiar with the Pacific Garbage Patch, basically what it is a mass of microplastics in the Pacific Ocean. There's a smaller one in the Atlantic too. The one in the Pacific is about the size of Texas, and it's floating around in a vortex by the ocean currents, getting in the way of fish, messing with the chemicals that are underwater, and a whole list of ecological things that are getting in the way of the world that we could have.
And the reason that it's all accumulated there is because of currents, right? The ocean's currents just push it all to this single vortex, which is, like you said, the size of Texas.
Well, so there's parts on the outside, and then they slowly get dragged in, kind of like how a satellite slowly gets dragged back in.
Really?
In the same way that a planet orbits something in, it's sort of spinning around the ocean, slowly getting pulled in. It's why warm water from the equator gets distributed elsewhere, and cold water from the Arctic gets distributed to the middle, and there's the flow of all the oceans. It's the exact same thing with the fish that travel through it, except this time, microplastics that get in the way of life.
So each of these, there's no single point that all of these are originating from. It's just the entire planet's waste.
A big portion of it is fish nets that were left out. That's a bigger proportion than the rest of the plastics, but I mean, who's to say the random things that are thrown in the ocean?
Lots of random stuff, like shipping containers.
Mm-hmm. So something that's scary about this is that it was only first described in 1988, even though it had been developing for a long time, which makes me wonder, what else is out there that we don't know about that we've created? You know, if we're just figuring out about one of the biggest problems in our entire environment 30 years ago, what do we not know about yet?
Do you know what the rate of growth is for the garbage patch?
I could figure it out really easily. I know right now it's 80,000 metric tons of plastic.
80,000 metric tons. Yeah. We're really polluting our waters. After talking with Toby in the shipping containers and how shipping containers will just get rocked off and thrown in the ocean, and we've got this massive size of Texas, 88,000 square meters.
Well, so something that's crazy. 9 billion tons of plastic produced, 7 billion tons of it are no longer in use. 9% of that 7 billion tons gets recycled. 12% of it gets burned, which, if you do the math, we're leaving 5.5 billion tons of litter in landfills and in the ocean. So I'm begging the question, when there are 10 times as many people as we have now on the planet, or even now, how do we stage our plastic use? How do we change our recycling infrastructure to appropriately address what could potentially be one of the most damaging problems to humanity's health?
I agree, and I think it's bigger than just asking people to recycle more, because we can tell people to put the recyclables in the recycling, but we know for a fact that a lot of the trash and recycling end up getting sent to the same places. So there are different ways that we really need to approach this. We were watching a video today in one of my urban spaces classes about Goodwill and other textiles all get just shipped mass bulk over to India. And then in India, they have to shred and then they reduce these fabrics all the way down to nothing. And the people who are working there, we were looking at their perspectives.
Yeah.
Just like,
they don't know the implications of it?
No, the Indian ladies are just like, these clothes don't even seem like they've been worn. Like and then they're looking at what do these Indians visualize Americans as being, because they've never been to Western America. They just see all of the clothes that we're throwing out and giving away. And they're like, these people must just be rich. They must be living the life of luxury because the dresses, you just see them trying them on, just look phenomenal. And then these ladies go and they strip them down to the bare thread and then they weave them back and get shipped back to the US. So it's just this
this repetitive process of fast fashion that we've grown into, where there are new sales every other week at companies rather than having one line every season. What we've seen is that the sea life is being affected by all of the products that we're throwing in the ocean, whether it's clothing or all the bottles that we consume with Coca-Cola or all of our other
things. Exactly. And
So,
it's not just clothing. That was just the example we saw today in class.
I mean,
but all of
it
our
goes
waste
to show how many different things there are that you don't realize have to be exposed somewhere.
Right, because the U.S. has a bunch of policies that says we have to, if you're going to recycle in the U.S., you have to use safe practices. But you can still export your trash to a different country like China or India, where those laws are much less regulated, so they can kind of do what they want, whether that's making people try to pick apart the rare earth metals from technology to try to get pieces of gold, or just throwing a bunch of plastics into a giant pile and then lighting it on fire.
How do we set a global standard for making sure that we are being stewards of our environment and giving our children the planet that they deserve? You know, if we continue on the trend that we're at, or if it gets worse, which I hope that it doesn't, but if it were to, we would be in a situation where we have to seriously consider the way we use our resources, or we would die.
I feel like it's not a single answer. It's like,
there are many different societal changes that need to happen for us to get to where we are using the exact amount of materials as our Earth can provide us over time.
Like every week, my roommate goes to Kroger and he buys a thing of eggs, and that's in a styrofoam egg container, and that is very difficult to recycle. Meanwhile, once a week, I go to Giant Eagle and I buy my eggs in a cardboard carton, which is much easier recycled. So it's like, as a consumer, I can make these choices. Do I buy my eggs in a styrofoam container, or do I buy my eggs in a cardboard container?
Right, so I think at a certain point, we're going to have to think, do we have to make the things that are hard to replicate much, much more expensive, so the demand for them goes down, and we get to the point where we're only consuming what's available to us? Because right now, it's sort of a situation where, if you imagine all of the materials we're using as debt, the past generations of this planet have been accumulating a lot of debt, and they're handing it over to us. And so they're saying, our entire infrastructure is built on consuming plastic. Good luck not wasting a lot more of it in the future. It's the same thing. So I guess the question that we want to ask you guys is, what fundamental changes can we make as a society so that the future that we have is better than the day of today? And I think plastic plays a massive role in that, because our rate of consumption is far beyond what we'll ever be able to replicate in the future when supply is low.